The wind howled across the endless plains of the Wild West, carrying dust through the dry, lifeless air. It moved like a restless spirit, sweeping over cracked earth and forgotten trails, where few dared to travel anymore. Far from any town, far from any sign of comfort or safety, stood a small wooden cabin. It was old, fragile, and barely standing against time. Inside that cabin lived a young girl named Lily. She was no older than 17, yet life had already tested her in ways most people could never imagine. Her clothes were faded and worn, stitched together more than once. Her boots were cracked from walking miles across rough land, and her hands told the real story, rough, tired, and marked by hard work. Every single day was a struggle. At sunrise, Lily would step out into the cold morning air, carrying an empty bucket as she walked miles just to find water. Sometimes the wells were dry. Sometimes the journey brought nothing back but exhaustion. Food was never guaranteed. Some days she ate, some days she didn't. But no matter how harsh life became, something inside her refused to break. Her heart. While the world around her had grown cold and selfish, Lily held on to something rare: kindness. As the sun slowly began to set, the sky turned into a burning mix of orange and red, casting long shadows across the land. Lily returned to her cabin, her steps slow and tired. She opened the wooden door, which creaked loudly, as if it too was exhausted from surviving. Inside, there was almost nothing. A small table, a broken chair, a weak bed, and a fireplace that barely kept the cold away. She gathered a few small sticks and lit a fire, watching the weak flame struggle to grow. From a tiny cloth bag, she pulled out what little food she had left, barely enough for one small meal. She looked at it quietly. For a moment, doubt crossed her face, but then she took a deep breath and whispered softly, "It will be enough." She didn't know it yet, but this simple night, this quiet, ordinary moment, was about to change her life forever. Night had fully taken over the land. The last light of the sun had disappeared behind the distant hills, leaving the vast Wild West covered in darkness. The wind grew colder now, sharper, slipping through every crack in Lily's fragile cabin. Inside, the small fire flickered weakly, struggling against the cold that surrounded it. Lily sat quietly near the fire, pulling her thin blanket closer around her shoulders. The flames danced softly in front of her tired eyes, casting moving shadows on the wooden walls. It was the kind of silence she was used to, deep, lonely, endless. Out here, there were no neighbors, no voices, no help, only the sound of the wind and her own thoughts. She slowly lay down on her small, worn bed, her body aching from the long day. Her stomach was not full, but she had learned to ignore hunger. Survival had taught her many things, and comfort was not one of them. She closed her eyes. For a moment, everything was still. Then, knock. Her eyes snapped open instantly. She didn't move. Maybe she imagined it. The wind often played tricks on old wood, making strange sounds in the night. She held her breath, listening carefully. Silence. Her heart began to slow again, but then, knock, knock. This time it was clear. Someone was at her door. Lily slowly sat up, her heartbeat rising. No one ever came here, not this late, not this far from town. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her mind. Who could it be? Why here? Was it safe? She stood up quietly, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. Every step she took felt heavy, cautious. The fire behind her crackled softly, as if warning her not to go further. But the knocking came again, softer this time, weaker, almost desperate. Lily reached the door. Her hand hovered near the handle. For a moment, she hesitated. Out here, trust could be dangerous. But something about the knock, it didn't feel threatening. It felt tired. Slowly, she opened the door just a little. The cold wind rushed inside instantly, blowing her hair back. And then she saw them. A tall cowboy stood in the darkness, his figure outlined by the faint moonlight. His hat was low, shadowing his face, but she could see enough to know he was exhausted. His clothes were covered in dust, his shoulders heavy, like he had been traveling for days, maybe longer. Beside him stood a small boy. The boy held tightly onto the cowboy's coat, his tiny hand shaking from the cold. His face was pale, his lips slightly trembling, and his eyes looked tired and scared. For a moment, none of them spoke. Only the wind filled the silence between them. Then the cowboy finally spoke, his voice low and worn. "We don't mean any trouble." He paused, as if even speaking required effort. "We've been on the road for a long time. My boy, he needs rest." Lily looked at the child again. The boy tried to stand strong, but his body betrayed him. He was cold, hungry, weak. The cowboy continued, "We just need a place for one night. We'll leave before sunrise." Lily's grip tightened on the door. Inside her cabin, there was almost nothing. No extra food, no extra blankets, no comfort to offer. If she let them in, she would have to give what little she had left. For a moment, her mind told her to say no, to protect herself, to survive. But her heart refused. She looked at the boy one more time. That was enough. Without another word, she slowly opened the door wider and stepped aside. "You can come in." Her voice was soft, but certain. The cowboy looked at her, surprised. He hadn't expected kindness so easily, especially from someone who clearly had so little. He gave a small nod. "Thank you." They stepped inside. The warmth of the weak fire touched them instantly, though it wasn't much. The boy moved closer to it quickly, holding his hands out, trying to feel something other than cold. Lily closed the door behind them, blocking out the harsh wind. For a moment, the small cabin felt different. Not less poor, not less broken, but less lonely. The cowboy removed his hat slowly, revealing a face marked by time and travel. His eyes scanned the room quietly. He saw everything. The empty shelves, the worn furniture, the quiet struggle. And yet, she had still said yes. He looked back at Lily. There was something in his expression now. Not pity, respect. Meanwhile, the boy sat near the fire, his breathing slowly calming. His warmth returned to his small body. Lily moved toward the fire, adding a few more small pieces of wood. The flames grew slightly, enough to bring a little more comfort into the room. No one spoke for a while. Words were not needed. In that small cabin, in the middle of nowhere, 3 lives had crossed paths for a reason still unknown. But one thing was already clear. This night was no longer ordinary, and the choice Lily had made would soon change everything.
The cabin door closed slowly behind them with a heavy wooden creak. Inside, the warm glow of the small fire immediately wrapped around the 3 strangers like a fragile shield against the cold outside world. The contrast was sharp. Outside was freezing darkness and howling wind. Inside was dim warmth and silence. The young woman stood near the door for a moment, watching them carefully. Her heart was still unsure, but her decision had already been made. There was no turning back now. The cowboy moved slowly, holding the small baby tightly in his arms. The baby was wrapped in an old cloth blanket, barely protecting it from the cold. The tiny child made weak sounds, not crying loudly, but trembling softly from exhaustion and hunger. The cowboy sat down near the fire without asking. His movements were slow, as if his body had been pushed beyond its limit for many days. Dust still covered his coat, and his face showed deep fatigue, like a man who had traveled too far with too little rest. The woman quietly moved closer to the fire and added a few dry wooden sticks. The flames grew slightly brighter, casting flickering shadows across the cabin walls. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Only the sound of burning wood filled the space. Then the baby shifted in the cowboy's arms, making a weak sound again. That sound broke something silent inside the woman. Without thinking too much, she turned toward her small storage corner. It was almost empty. A small sack hung there, nearly finished. Inside it was the last of her food: dry bread pieces, a little grain, and almost nothing else. Enough for maybe one small meal, or less. She paused. For a moment, she looked at it. This was all she had. If she gave it away, she would have nothing left for tomorrow. But then she looked back. The baby. So small, so weak, completely dependent on someone else for survival. The cowboy noticed her hesitation. He didn't speak. He didn't ask. He just watched quietly, as if he already understood what she was thinking. Slowly, the woman picked up the food bag. Her hands tightened slightly. Then she walked over and placed it near the fire. I don't have much," she said softly, her voice almost breaking, "but this might help." The cowboy looked at her for a long moment, not with surprise, not with pity, but with deep respect. He gently nodded. "Thank you," he said quietly. The woman prepared the food quickly using a small pot over the fire. The smell of warm grains slowly filled the cabin, simple but comforting. She carefully brought the bowl closer and placed it in front of them. The cowboy didn't eat first. Instead, he held the baby closer, trying to warm it near the fire. Only after making sure the child was slightly calmer did he finally take a small portion of food. The baby's breathing slowly became steadier. Outside, the wind continued to roar. But inside the cabin, something had changed. It was not wealth. It was not safety. It was something much rarer in this harsh world. Trust. The woman sat at a small distance, watching them quietly. Her own hunger remained, but something else had started growing inside her. A strange feeling she had not experienced in a long time. Purpose, meaning, connection. The cowboy looked around the cabin again, noticing how little she had. No proper furniture, no proper supplies, just survival. Yet she had still given them everything she could. After a long silence, he finally spoke again. "You shouldn't live like this alone," he said slowly. The woman didn't answer immediately. She just looked at the fire. "I manage," she replied softly. But even she knew it wasn't really true. The baby made a small sound again, this time softer, almost peaceful. And for the first time since they arrived, the cabin didn't feel empty anymore. It felt shared. But none of them knew yet that this single night was only the beginning of something far bigger than survival.
The night grew deeper. Outside the small wooden cabin, the Wild West was still alive with cold wind and endless darkness. The desert stretched far beyond sight, swallowing every sound except the howling air. Inside the cabin, the fire had burned lower now, but it still gave enough warmth to keep life alive in the room. The young woman sat quietly near the wall, her eyes half closed but still aware. She hadn't slept properly, not because she was afraid, but because something inside her kept her awake, a feeling she didn't fully understand yet, as if this night was not like any other. Near the fire, the cowboy held the baby tightly in his arms. The child was calmer now. The warmth had slowly brought comfort back into its tiny body. The soft breathing of the baby became steady, no longer trembling as much as before. The cowboy kept his coat slightly wrapped around the child, shielding it even more from any remaining cold. Time passed slowly. No one spoke. The only sound in the cabin was the soft crackle of burning wood and the faint wind slipping through cracks in the wooden walls. But then, the cowboy opened his eyes wider. He had not been sleeping deeply, just resting lightly, like a man who never truly relaxes anymore. He carefully shifted the baby in his arms and looked toward the woman. She was still there, sitting silently, tired but kind. For a long moment, he just watched her. Something was different about this woman. She had nothing, yet she gave everything. And in a world like his, that kind of person was rare. Slowly, he lowered his head and gently adjusted his coat around the baby again. Then, quietly, he made a decision. Carefully, without making any noise, he stood up. Every movement was slow, controlled, as if even the floor might wake the world. He looked down at his sleeping child one last time. The baby's small face was peaceful now, resting safely in warmth that wasn't his own. The cowboy's eyes softened. For a brief moment, he looked less like a traveler and more like a father who had finally found safety for his child, even if only for one night. Then he turned. Step by step, he moved toward the small wooden table. The woman did not move. She did not know he was watching her one last time. On the table, there was an old piece of wood and a few worn papers she had used earlier. The cowboy pulled out a folded note. He placed it carefully. Then he reached into his coat and placed something heavier beside it. A small bag. It landed with a quiet but solid sound. Money. A lot more than she could imagine. But he didn't stop there. He also placed a sealed document. Official papers, stamped and signed. Ownership. Land. Future. Everything folded neatly into one moment. The cowboy stood there for a second longer, looking at what he had left behind. Then he exhaled slowly. Not a sigh of relief, but of respect. He walked back to the fire one last time. He looked at the woman again, still sleeping, still unaware. And for the first time, the cowboy's expression showed something deeper than exhaustion. Gratitude. He gently adjusted the baby in his arms. Then, without another sound, he turned toward the door. The wooden door creaked softly as he opened it. Cold air rushed inside instantly, swallowing the warmth of the cabin for a moment. He paused at the doorway. The wind touched his face. The desert waited. Behind him was a woman who had changed his perspective of the world in one night. Ahead of him was a long road, but now with purpose. He stepped out. The baby moved slightly in his arms, but did not cry. The cowboy pulled his coat tighter. And then he disappeared into the dark Wild West night. No goodbye. No sound. Only silence remained. Inside the cabin, the fire flickered gently, unaware that everything had just changed forever.
Morning arrived slowly over the Wild West. The first light of sunrise spread across the endless desert, turning the sky into soft shades of gold and pale orange. The wind was quieter now, almost peaceful, as if the night itself had finally come to rest. Inside the small wooden cabin, silence still remained. The fire had almost completely faded, leaving only a few glowing embers that flickered weakly in the ashes. The young woman began to wake. At first, she didn't move. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the soft morning light coming through the cracks in the wooden walls. For a few seconds, she simply stared at the ceiling, trying to understand the strange feeling inside her chest. Something felt different. The night before felt almost unreal. Slowly, she sat up. The cabin was empty. Her eyes immediately scanned the room. No cowboy, no baby, no sound, just silence. For a moment, her heart tightened. Did they leave without saying anything? Did something happen? She stood up quickly, her bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. She walked toward the center of the room, looking around carefully. Then she noticed it. On the small wooden table, a folded piece of paper, and something else beside it, a bag. Her breath slowed. Step by step, she moved closer. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the paper first. She opened it carefully. The writing was simple, but every word carried weight. Your kindness saved more than you know. A heart like yours is rare in this world. I will never forget what you did. Her eyes softened, but before she could fully process the words, her gaze shifted to the bag. Slowly she opened it and froze. Inside was money, not a small amount, a life-changing amount, more than she had ever seen in her entire life combined. Her hands started shaking. She stepped back slightly, as if the weight of it was too much to hold. Her breathing became uneven. "No, this can't be real," she whispered. Then she saw something else. A document. Official papers. Stamped, signed, legal. She carefully picked it up, her eyes scanning the words. And then, she understood. Her mind stopped for a second. The land nearby, the property, everything written inside the document, was now hers. The cowboy wasn't just a traveler. He was someone powerful, someone who had the ability to change lives. And somehow, he had chosen her. Her legs weakened slightly, and she slowly sat down again, holding both the letter and the document tightly. The silence in the cabin felt different now. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of shock, full of disbelief, full of something she had never experienced before. Hope. She looked around the cabin again. The broken walls, the empty shelves, the worn floor. But now, everything felt different. It was still the same place, but she was no longer the same person. Outside, the sun rose higher, painting the desert in warm golden light. And inside that fragile wooden cabin, a poor girl's entire life had just changed in a single night. Not because she took something, but because she gave everything when she had nothing. Days passed slowly after that unforgettable morning. The desert outside the small wooden cabin looked the same as always, endless, quiet, and empty under the wide Wild West sky. But inside the cabin, everything had already begun to change. The young woman still sat sometimes in silence, holding the memory of that night like something fragile and unreal. She would look at the document again and again, as if it might disappear if she blinked too long. At first, she didn't tell anyone. She didn't even fully understand how to react. A part of her still believed it might be a dream. But reality slowly began to arrive.
One morning, the sound of horses broke the silence, louder, closer, and more than before. She stepped outside her cabin carefully, shielding her eyes from the sunlight. And then she saw them, a group of well-dressed men riding toward her across the desert. Dust rose behind their horses as they approached, not like strangers, but like people who already knew where they were going. They stopped in front of her cabin. One of the men stepped forward. He removed his hat respectfully. "Are you the owner of this land?" he asked. Her heart tightened. She didn't even know how to answer at first. I don't know," she said honestly. The man smiled slightly and held out official papers. "These are your lands now. Everything here is legally under your name." For a moment, she couldn't move. The wind passed through the desert behind her, but she felt nothing except shock. Then the truth settled in fully. It was real. All of it. The money, the land, the documents, everything was hers. The men began working immediately. Within hours, the silence of her broken world started to change. Supplies were brought in. Wood, food, tools. People began repairing the old cabin, strengthening its walls, fixing what had been broken for so long. For the first time in her life, she didn't have to struggle alone. She stood watching everything happen, overwhelmed and silent. But inside her chest, something even deeper was changing. Not wealth, not power, but identity. She was no longer just a forgotten girl surviving in the desert. She was someone who had been seen. Days turned into weeks. The small, broken cabin slowly transformed. What was once a symbol of survival became a home, a real home. But the most important change was not outside. It was inside her. One evening, as the sun set again over the Wild West, she stood outside her cabin once more. The sky was the same as that night when everything began. Orange, red, endless. But now she was different. She closed her eyes for a moment and remembered everything. The knock in the night, the cold baby, the tired cowboy, the choice she made without thinking twice. And now, the life she had received in return. She didn't smile because she was rich. She smiled because she understood something deeper. Kindness was never wasted. It always returns in ways you never expect. As the wind moved gently across the desert, she whispered softly to herself, "I gave when I had nothing, and life gave me everything." And under the vast Wild West sky, her new life finally began.